Welcome to the Homeless Conservative. I'm your host, Blake Fisher. Thank you for joining me. I'm doing another solo one due to this past week's unfortunate, terrible, awful news out of Maine, where we had an active shooter situation going from place to place. I think he killed 18 people, and they were trying to find him for 48 hours. So people were just locked in their homes, and everything was shut down because they didn't know if this guy was alive. Had he escaped? Was he going to try to kill more people? And it's just one more of these mass shooting events that we've had in America that have seen an uptick in the last couple of years and have kind of been, honestly, a part of our lives for decades now. And immediately when these things happen, I hear the left and the right just immediately go to their corners and start spouting the same kind of, I want to call them bullet points, but that seems like in poor taste. But it's the same things we hear every time. And the most common refrain is like, we need common sense gun control laws. And the sentiment of that, I think, is right. I think people want to stop these things. And I hate when people on the left pretend that the people on the right don't care that these are happening and that people are dying. I think that's wrong. I think we just have different opinions about what the solution to the problem is, if there even is a solution to the problem, because I think it is a hard problem to solve. So I want to spend an episode kind of diving into some of the data. So apologies for all of the numbers and charts that I'm going to throw at you. If you're watching on YouTube or Spotify, I will put these things up on the screen, so it might be a little easier to follow along on those things. And if you're listening, I'll link to a lot of my sources in the show notes. Then you can go read the stuff for yourself. And I think it's just important that with this kind of, with any topic, but especially these ones that you end up with a lot of emotions and sort of attacks of the other side, where the right accuses the left of just wanting to take all of our guns, and the left accuses the right of not caring about innocent people being mowed down by an active shooter. I don't think either one of those caricatures are true for the most part, and yet we just retreat to our corners and basically end up not doing anything about this. And people are always like, we've got to do something if it saves one life, et cetera. But I don't think we should just do something. I think we should do something that is provably going to work, or at least on the margins, cut down on the number of these incidents that happen. So let's go over some facts first, as sort of an intro to some of the data that I'm going to present. So defining mass shooting is the first thing that's difficult, because everyone has a different definition for this. If you read any news at all, you've probably seen the outrageous number that you're going to see in a lot of these that are going to say there have been 560 some odd mass shootings so far this year in 2023. So more shootings than days that we've had so far in the year. Those all reference one specific source called the Gun Violence Archive, and they specifically, in their criteria, say we are going to count any time multiple people are injured in a shooting, and I think they say their number is 4. They might have even reduced it to 3, but either way, they basically say we're going to count anything. So the problem with that number is that it counts any time multiple people are shot, whether they're killed, whether that was a domestic situation inside of a house, whether that was gang violence and a drive-by shooting, whether that was an armed robbery. And I don't think it helps to try to lump all gun violence together, or all violence, or any of it, because they all have different solutions. Like, some things we can solve with, deterrence in one way, some things we can solve other ways, but you cannot solve all of them with one specific policy. Although some people on the left say it's solved by, we just make guns illegal and get rid of the Second Amendment. I don't think that's very realistic, but let's just take that one off the table. And so I think that we need to define mass shooting very specifically. So the FBI, Gun Violence Archive references that the FBI does not have a definition for mass shooters, which you're correct. They don't, but they do have a definition for an active shooter. And so that's what they call these situations, where generally someone goes into a public place and indiscriminately is shooting civilians who they do not know. There's no relation to them. They're just trying to kill as many people as possible. Normally it's these kind of lone wolf situations, these youngish, isolated men for the most part, and their goal is the notoriety, essentially. And a lot of times their goal is to either be shot by police in the process or to kill themselves at the end of it, and basically to go out with as much notoriety as possible instead of in obscurity like they would if they just killed themselves in their house. And So I think that we have to define these. So I'm calling them, what I'm going to say mass shooting, like I'll probably accidentally say mass shooting a bunch. I'll say active shooter. What I'm talking about is that kind of event that happened in Maine recently, where a guy goes into a bowling alley and starts shooting people. And then he goes to a bar and starts shooting people. Someone goes to a mall, or someone goes to a concert, or these kind of situations where the goal is to find a place where a lot of people are and you're raining terror upon them by opening fire. And so the FBI, by their definition, say there have been 333 in the 20 years that was 1999 to 2019. FBI is always just a little bit behind on data. So I think it's important to not look at single years, because sometimes they're not good enough. So I want to look at a broad 20-year period of time. That's what the FBI has looked at from, like I said, 99 to 2019. In their numbers, so they have 333 compared to the 500 some odd that Gun Violence Archive would say have happened this year. So FBI data is not perfect, because there's some other people that say that number is lower. There's some people that have it higher. I just think the FBI is a good, let's just agree on the FBI's definition. So 333. In those shootings, there have been 1,023 people killed and 1,700 people injured. Just to give you some perspective on what that means compared to the overall murder rate, in that same period of time, 1999 to 2019, there were over 337,000 murders in that period of time. So if you look at the percentage of how many people died in mass shooting events or active shooter events, 0.3% of murders over that 20 years. So 0.3%, that's just a really, really small percent. The reason it matters is not for me to shrug them off and say, well, it doesn't happen that often really, so we shouldn't worry about it. That's not my point. I think we should try to do something about it. It does make tracking the data really hard, because they are rare, even though they've increased over the last few years. And so my data obviously is a little out of date, because I'm missing 4 years of these shooters, and they have gone up they kind of dropped in 2020 a little bit, and then they went up in 2021, 22, and 23 so far. So I admit that my numbers, but keep in mind, these things take a while to compile and analyze and stuff. So I'm not doing the thing that a lot of people do with stats, where they just pick the years that work well for their argument. I really am it's that we don't have a ton of information via the FBI past 2019 with specific reference to active shooters. Some other publications do. So Mother Jones, for example, they define it as indiscriminate rampages in public places resulting in 4 or more victims killed by the attacker. So there's even a difference between the FBI. The reason the FBI number is higher than Mother Jones, which is a very left publication, is because Mother Jones is only looking at 4 or more victims killed by the attacker. Whereas the FBI is going, look, if someone came in and tried to shoot a bunch of people and none of them died, we're still calling that an active shooter incident. I tend to actually agree with the FBI's definition here, just because if the point is to try to stop the active shooter incidents, we need to know everything about them, even if they weren't successful. We need to kind of know what, where did it happen? What kind of weapons did they use? What was their goal? And so I think that's important. So Mother Jones says there's only been 148 total in the last 40 years. That's looking from, I think, 82 to 2002, I think is what that is. Might be wrong about that. I'll put it in the notes. But so we really are talking about a rare occurrence. It's just that every time one happens, you're going to see it in the news. And so it's one of those things where it's like an airplane crash. The news is never going to tell us about the tens of thousands of flights that took off and landed successfully without any issues. They're going to tell us about the plane crash. And there's nothing evil or inherently wrong with the way they do that. These mass shooting events are newsworthy. But as we'll talk about later, I think we might give them an outsized amount of attention for what they really impact. And most of that's because of the fear. It's like the idea of being at a school and someone coming in with that's the most horrifying thing ever, right? And especially if you're a parent for your kids. So it's understandable that it grabs all of our attention and that we want to solve it. And I really do think that most people do want to solve this. But to me, it's just ridiculous. Don't ever, anytime you read an article or see the news where they reference, there have been more mass shootings this year than there are days. They're referencing one source, which I think is counting way too much stuff. That's still a lot of violent crime. Don't get me wrong. But 50% of that is gang violence. So I don't think we solve gang violence the same way we solve mass shootings. I just don't think they're the same problem, and so they don't have the same solution. And I think anyone using those numbers is trying to artificially inflate the number of incidents to make you more fearful or to make it more reasonable to do things like take away Second Amendment rights. So I think it's important to know those numbers. Well, so let's talk about the actual cases and what the FBI looks at. So there are some important data sets. This FBI report that I linked to in the notes, it has a lot of information about where they happen, the demographics of the shooters themselves, the like how many people versus civilians versus police versus security guards are involved in them, how they're stopped eventually, are they arrested, do they take their own lives, are they shot by police? So it has a lot of data that goes into the weeds. I don't think the aftermath of what happens matters as much as what leads up to it, as far as when we're saying we're trying to prevent these from happening. And so I'm going to talk mostly about, what actually happens in the shootings themselves. So in 75% of the cases, the shooters legally obtain their firearms. The FBI, unfortunately, does not go into detail about what that means. But here's what I think, is that 75% of the cases mean they either purchased it by passing a background check and buying it from a federal firearm dealer, or they purchased it legally from a private citizen, because our gun laws are such that I can't, in most states, not all the states, but in most states, you can, I can buy a gun from a friend. So he can be selling a gun, I can purchase it from him. That's totally legal. I do not have to pass a background check. It would be legal. So, but the FBI doesn't specify like how many people do that versus go to Bass Pro Shop and purchase a gun. It doesn't specify the breakdown there. But in 75% of the cases, they are buying these guns legally. They are allowed to they either are allowed to purchase the gun or they pass the background check and they didn't steal the gun or purchase it on the black market. And then when we talk about the guns they use, I think it's important to look at this, because 63% of the time they use handguns and 26% of the time they use some form of rifle, although the FBI does not differentiate between what we commonly call assault weapons and regular rifles, for the main purpose of they're used in so few crimes, there's not a big difference. And honestly, there are not definable differences between them. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about an assault weapons ban and why I don't think it works. But so FBI just counts rifles, all rifles together, and 26% of the time. So more than double people use handguns as opposed to rifles. And 11% of the time they've used a shotgun. I think the very obvious reason for that is that long guns are harder to conceal. I can't put an AR in my pants and walk through the mall very inconspicuously, okay? So handguns are used the most. The most deadly mass shooting we've ever had was at Virginia Tech. Well, actually, sorry, not ever had, because the Vegas one took that over. But that was a slightly different situation. But either way, that one, the Virginia Tech one, was 2 handguns. That's all he had, 2 handguns. So handguns are used a lot more. We don't see as much of that in the news, I feel like, because there's just a bias. And the truth is, most media is bent towards a liberal worldview, and they don't like these guns because they're scary, and they think that banning them will solve this problem. I think they're genuine. I just think they're wrong a lot of times. So anyway, we don't see a lot about the mass shootings that happen with handguns, I think, because of that reason. So we tend to see the ones that are carried out using what most people call assault rifles or assault weapons, although that's a little bit of a misnomer too. We'll get into that in a little bit as well. As far as demographics go and where these things happen, they happen all over the country. There's only a handful of states that have not had a mass shooting in that 20-year period of time, and they don't make a lot of sense. I didn't go into the weeds of every single state. I would like to do this where I actually look at the laws compared to that, but I mean, I couldn't find a report that very easily broke that down. So I did some basic math on some of the top ones. So the top 3 places over that 1999 to 2019 period of time were California had 42, Florida had 27, and Texas had 25. This is from the FBI data, by the way. If you divide that by like per million people that live in those states, because obviously the common thing there is all 3 of those states are 3 of the most populous states in the country. So that would be 1.08 per million people in California. In Florida, it's 1.22 per million people. And in Texas, it's 0.83 shootings per million people. The reason I think that breakdown of population versus how often it happens is at least a little bit interesting is if you combine it with the gun laws, because obviously Texas and California are 2 states with very, very, very different gun laws. And you also have a combination of urban and rural areas in all three of those places. But to me, it's interesting because the stricter gun laws obviously doesn't equate fewer mass shootings, because California has way stricter gun laws, but has more mass shootings per population than Texas does. Florida also has more lax gun laws than California, but it has more. So I don't think that, correlation does not equal causation, but it's worth at least looking at the policies that are happening in these places and going, okay, did that policy prevent the outcome? And like I said, for this purpose of this episode, I'm just talking about these active shooter mass shooting incidents because I want to focus on this one thing and see if we can find a solution to it. I would think that California, having the most of any other state, and like I said, I will go through maybe at some point and divide all of them by population to see, like, okay, per capita, is it really happening more here? Is it not happening? But, for example, a state like Montana has had, I think, 0. Well, that probably has to do with population density more than it has to do with their gun laws, I'm going to guess, but don't know. There's a lot of different data you can look into. And anyone, including me, can just make up statistics based on trying to find, their point of view and support it with statistics. And I think you can lie about this stuff. So just be wary of things that leave out specific date ranges or only look at one specific year or really short periods of time. Sometimes looking at long periods of time is hard because we're trying to go back and look at, like, okay, what happened at this shooting in 2002 where we're not as likely to be able to get the information we need right now looking back. And so I think the faster that we can get this information, which, side note, right now we can't have scientific studies of gun violence paid for by federal dollars. And I think that's silly for Republicans in Congress to not let that happen, because I think that the data would, the reason I am a Second Amendment guy and I like guns is because I think there's more data that shows that they save lives more than they take lives. But we need more data on that to be able to prove that. So I think it's silly that we don't allow there to be research on this. But where there has been research, I'll share that with you and try to be as honest about my priors as possible. So, who are these shooters? I think that's another important thing, because we've talked about what kind of weapons they use. We've talked about where they tend to be. By the way, there's also in the FBI breakdown, there's a ton of, as I mentioned, like where it happens. The most common place is like public places that are either like public businesses, so like malls, for example, or totally public places like parks, where you got people out in the open in public and stuff. They also happen in government buildings and private places and things, but overwhelmingly, the vast majority of them are in public places where there are large groups of people, schools, things like that. The who they are is, I think, very important. So they're overwhelmingly male. Everyone knows this. There have only been, according to the FBI, 13 in that period of time, that 20-year period of time, 99 to 2019, 13 female shooters. And some of those were working with a guy, like San Bernardino, for example. That was a couple, a man and a woman. And I'm just going to guess it was the guy's idea. I think I can say that. They're generally in the range of like 20 to 50 years old. More of them are in their 20s and 30s than in their 40s. But there's not a lot of the teenagers. It happens sometimes, and I think it makes a huge splash anytime there's a teenager. But really, for the most part, these are 20s and 30s into the 40s year old males who are typically single. They're typically loners. They don't have a lot of friends. Generally, there's always signs that this was going to happen. They were violent in other ways in the past, but not enough to have a criminal record most of the time, which means they pass background checks when they go to purchase weapons. That specifically is really tricky to solve, just because someone's a loner and kind of weird and maybe doesn't have any friends. And even if they have some like violent tendencies, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a mass shooter. But we can't prevent people from buying guns without adjudication of some sort right now. So you have to be charged with a crime, found guilty of that crime, to go onto a list that would allow you to go try to pass a background check and get denied. And, I think that's important to keep in mind. That's one of the things that's really challenging about this. One thing that is a little bit of a, I don't know if it's like a myth, but a lot of times people will say this is all young white guys. It's not really. Actually, when you look at the races of the people, the FBI statistics are let's see, 58% white, 19% black. Actually, this wasn't FBI. This was someone else that I got these numbers from. But 58% white, 19% black, 8% Latino, 7% Asian. If I'm looking at 2020 census data, which is not perfect because, those numbers are from the aggregate of the 20 years, and I'm only looking at 2020 census data in which Latino population went up significantly. So these numbers are not perfect, just so you know. But that's spot on for the 2020 census data for white and Asian people. Basically, Asian people are 8% of the population and white people are 59% of the population. And in the shootings, they're represented as 58% white and 7% Asian. But there are a higher number of black mass shooters in these active shooter situations than their population. 19% of the shooters were black, 13% of the population is black, and Latinos are way underrepresented. So something like 20% of the population is now Latino, whereas only 8% of the mass shooters. But keep in mind, that's a little bit of a weirdness because the population of Latino population, it's gone way up over the last 20 years. And so there's a little bit of weirdness there. But the point is, it's pretty proportional. Slightly higher black population, less Latino population, but those could be written off. There's probably lots of other explanations, but to pretend that this is a white problem, I think the reason I worry about that is because it puts I think it takes other people off our radar as, well, they're not potentially a mass shooter when they may exhibit the same signs that these other people do. And there's plenty of data showing that, in these sort of despair categories of people, for example, you look at the suicide rate and it is incredibly way higher for single males who are lonely, maybe don't have jobs, still live with their parents. Like that number, it like correlates with suicide rates really high. And and drug overdoses are another thing that's popular and with that demographic. And we're starting to see upticks in that with minorities too. So we're starting to see way more black overdoses of fentanyl and black male suicides. And so my concern with it, and I don't bring this up to like try to race bait or something. That's not my purpose here. My purpose is to say, when we're looking for warning signs, race should not be one of the caveats to it, because we're seeing increases in stuff like I said, fentanyl overdoses and suicide rates. And I think there's a huge overlap between the suicide rate of these men and the ones that are basically want to kill themselves, but they want to go out like this, shooting a bunch of people first. And so I think it's important to pay attention to that despair level of specifically isolated men in their 20s, 30s, 40s, to look at who's the potential next mass shooter and who might be a suicide risk too. So that's the reason I think it's important. That's basically who it is. Let's talk about the solutions that come up. So obviously every time these things happen, we get the term common sense gun reform. We should have gun laws that are common sense. And what I don't like about that argument is that everyone on the left says that. I hear it mostly on the left, and I hear people on the right just kind of repeat it. But to me on the left, what it means is that if you disagree with me, you don't have common sense. That's how I at least read it. Maybe that's unfair of my reading of their tone, or especially when they say it. They're almost saying like, oh, look, I mean, like the only reason we can't have common sense gun laws in this country, they blame it on the NRA and, people that are just clinging to their weapons and people that care more about owning weapons than they care about innocent lives. That's how it's always framed. And I just think it's such a non-starter for the conversation. And I don't like it. So common sense to me means that we should be able to look at data and we should be able to say, here's a change we made, and here's the result of that. Here are the unintended consequences. Like common sense is only common sense because it's things that work. Common sense would be you should roll up your windows in your car if it's raining if you don't want to get all that water inside your car. That's common sense because we can immediately, if you leave your windows down in a rainstorm, or let's say you should lock your doors at night, that's common sense because if you leave your door unlocked, obviously someone can just walk in or someone can just open your car and steal it. To me, common sense means that like there's a direct, here's the thing that we did and here's the result of it. And this is such a weird problem to solve that I don't think common sense comes into it. Mostly because there is no common sense and there is no, we cannot feel the same way as the people that commit these kind of atrocities, right? There's no way that I'm going to be able to get into the head of someone that would do this because I don't want to murder people. And I know that that's wrong. And so common sense to me is just a bad misnomer. So I'm not going to say common sense gun control. I'm just going to say, what are the laws or the things we can do? Because some of them aren't even laws. And let's just go through the proposals that we hear every time. So the first is obviously we should ban assault weapons. That's the first thing that comes out. These things shouldn't exist. You're going to, after any kind of thing like this, you're going to get people on the left that are saying, there's no reason anyone should have this. You can't give me a good reason why no one needs an AR. Okay, first let's define what an assault weapon is. There is no really such thing. What are commonly called like AR-15s. The AR stands for Armalite rifle. It does not stand for assault rifle. This is just something that got made up at some point and we've all ran with it. So whatever, it is common language now. So I might say AR, I might say assault weapons, but I don't like the term assault weapons. I think that every weapon by definition is for assault. Every one of them. But it depends what the person who has the weapon is doing with it. So pepper spray is an assault weapon, technically, because I can spray it at someone and the purpose of it is to hurt that person so that I can get away from them or whatever. And firearms are the same thing. Everything obviously is an assault. And that's why the number one rule of being a firearm owner or handling one is you never point it at anything or anyone you don't want to kill or destroy. Because you've got to treat it like that. And so doesn't matter if you think it's unloaded, you should never point it at someone. You should never point it at something that you don't want to destroy because that's what guns do, okay? So the assault weapons definition is tricky, and it was even tricky in law. We had an assault weapons ban in the 90s that lasted for 10 years. In that, defining what an assault weapon was really tricky because so much of what you commonly think of as an assault rifle, you think of this scary military thing, and people call them military grade weapons all the time. They're not military grade. They're not the same as what the Army has. They may look like it, but there's a huge, huge difference between them. So the main thing, first of all, is that rifles that the common people, citizens in the United States can purchase are semi-automatic, meaning you pull the trigger once, it fires one bullet, and then you pull the trigger again to fire a second bullet. And so there's really no difference in how fast I can fire a rifle versus a handgun that's semi-automatic. They both, so like this is the thing. How fast can I do this with my finger, okay? Accurately too. I mean, that's another key piece of information there is I can obviously just do this as much as I want, but am I really going to hit anything? But the point is handgun versus so-called assault rifles, there's no difference in the speed of which you can shoot people, okay? Whereas military rifles have three different modes on them. One is just a single semi-automatic where you just fire one bullet per trigger pull, or there's a burst where you can do 3 at a time. So one trigger pull is 3 projectiles. And then you've got fully automatic, which means I pull the trigger. This is what we commonly think all criminals have because of movies. Thanks Hollywood. But you pull the trigger and we're spraying bullets at people. Okay. That is not legal for United States citizens to have since the 80s, okay? The only way you can get one, you can get permits. It's a long process. It costs a lot of money. And manufacturers cannot manufacture fully automatic weapons for the public, but the old ones were grandfathered in. And so the only way you can purchase a fully automatic weapon after getting all the permits and all that stuff through the federal government, you have to buy an old one. And supply and demand, I don't know if you know how that works economically, but the supply stays the exact same or goes down as these weapons break or get lost or whatever. Lost, I guess, you wouldn't lose it, hopefully. But, that number's going down and the demand goes up. And so they get really expensive. They are thousands and thousands of dollars. So most common criminals and even people wanting to do something like a mass shooting are not going to try to find an automatic weapon. The closest thing to it that we had was the Vegas shooting where the guy had a bump stock that sort of, I don't want to get into the bump stock thing, but basically it's a thing that basically pushes I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this. It's a stock that has like a spring in it. And so that as you fire, you're essentially pulling the weapon forward. It's like a spring-loaded thing so that you keep your finger in the same place, but it's pulling the trigger over and over again. And that is what he was using, which is why it sounded like automatic fire, but it was a little intermittent and not totally great. So those do exist. There's there was a federal ban on them that Trump signed. I can't remember if that got reversed or not. Either way, the point is automatic weapons have not been used in any of these. That's the closest thing to it. And so there is a big difference. Don't call these military style weapons or weapons of war. They're not weapons of war. These aren't even the weapons that you would use. Most ARs are not even things that you would take deer hunting. Okay. They don't have a high enough caliber to even take down a deer. So to pretend that this is only a weapon of war and is only at use in the battlefield is just not true. People use them to kill coyotes, and people use them for fun, and people use them for self-defense. They're really, they can be lightweight and really stable, much more so than a handgun. Honestly, I would say they're way easier to handle than a shotgun, even though everyone says a shotgun's the best like home defense thing. I think ARs are actually a little bit better because they're not quite as cumbersome and they have higher round capacity and stuff. So I think there's some very like good reason to have that instead of a shotgun, but that's a personal preference. I'm not going to get into that, but the point is when people say they're weapons of war, not necessarily true. When people say they can define what an assault rifle is, they generally can't. And it was really hard in the 90s too, because so much of it is just aesthetics. It's the way it looks. It's not really anything about the way it functions. I could show a picture and I'll put it up on the screen. This is a common rifle. This is versus an AR. Which one's more deadly and why? Well, most of the things that defined an AR in the AR ban of the federal government in the 90s or in like places like California is all aesthetic stuff. It's like, oh, you can't have a pistol grip on the barrel. Okay, well, holding the barrel versus holding a pistol grip, I don't understand how that's going to make it much different. Or the kind of stock you can have on it, or the kind of scope, or all these things that are just accessories. Basically, ARs are grown men's Lego, all right? Some of us, like me, still play with Legos too, but the point is it's mostly aesthetic. So it's hard to define, and there's a lot of ways to work around it. During the AR ban, there were things that looked like ARs, but met only one or two of the criteria, so they weren't technically ARs, so they could be sold. So it's a really hard category to define. I'll link to some articles that explain a little bit more about why, but then we look at the AR ban that we had in federal, across the whole country in the 90s, and almost everyone agrees it didn't really have an effect on violent crime. Violent crime was already going down, and no one could prove that, yes, this made a difference, or no, it didn't make a difference. It just seems to have not made a difference because they're used in so few crimes. It's mostly a handgun problem that we have with violent crime. People don't rob banks with ARs for the most part. They rob them with handguns. And so I think that there is, because it's such a small percentage of crimes in general, and it's definitely a teeny tiny percentage of these kind of violent crimes, because like we'll talk about some more stats in a second on like overall weapons use, but it doesn't seem to make, it's hard to find the data because they're so few and far between, and so it's kind of hard to see. But California had a ban too, and as I mentioned, they've had the same number of active incidents per capita as other states that didn't. So if you can show me better data that says that, yeah, it's working better in California, or that, yeah, we had a significant drop in the number of these kind of things over the course of the time of the assault weapons ban, then I'm all for it. I just haven't been able to find it. The other problem with these assault weapon bans is that they're starting to get struck down in court. So just recently, in the last few weeks, a federal judge struck down the California assault weapons ban that's been in place for decades, right? Because they have some rules specifically of like, you can purchase one, but it has to have a special tool that you use to release the magazine. It can only have a 10-round magazine. There's some really specific points to it. And a federal judge struck it down because recently in the Supreme Court, they have specifically said, okay, yes, there can be, like in the Heller decision from 2008, which is kind of the first thing where the Supreme Court really said, look, yes, the Second Amendment is an individual right to bear arms. In that opinion, we had Scalia specifically said, we are not saying that you cannot have gun control laws. Reasonable gun control laws are fine, but you can't ban everyone from owning individuals from owning guns. And one of the more recent decisions said specifically, I think the language was, I'm going to look for it, commonly used by law-abiding citizens for self-defense. We are now in a situation where there are like an estimated 20 million ARs in private hands in the United States. So very commonly used. And for the most part, we do not see crimes committed with them, especially murders and violent crimes. So the for example of that would be that all rifles account for fewer murders than body parts, like hands and feet and fists and choking people. Okay, so just like to put that in perspective, it's less than 2% of all murders. This is, I think, for I don't remember if this is for one specific year in my notes or if this was for that 20-year period of time, but either way, it's pretty close. Basically, 2% were with all rifles. Remember, FBI does not differentiate between assault rifles, so-called, and regular, any other kind of long rifle gun. And so, anyway, 2%, less than 2% are used for murders, whereas 4.3% of murders were using hands, feet, etc. 10% were knife, 11% were other weapons. A really large amount were handguns. And so 45% were handguns. And so basically rifles are used in very few crimes. So it's hard for courts, it's hard for people to sue states or whatever and say, or like this can be law when they're getting challenged in courts going, well, look, there's 20 million people in this country that have managed not to murder anyone with their rifles. And everyone has hands and feet and fists and stuff. And that murders more people every year. So I just think that these are going to start going down in court and you're not going to be able to do them anyway. But I also just don't think they work. We look at California, look at the federal law. It didn't make that big of a difference. So I think assault weapon bans are useless to talk about because they're not even used in most of these mass shootings. Like I said, what was it? 68% of them are using handguns. So I just think that we've got to, even if the handgun ones don't make more of a splash, and obviously we can't ban handguns. So, I just think this one's non-starter. Okay. What about universal background checks? So this is another one we hear all the time. We need universal background checks. Well, as I mentioned earlier, 75% of them, according to the FBI, obtained their weapons legally. So doesn't seem that universal background checks would help. I want to explain a little bit about the background check system because I think that's an important thing to understand how this works. So if I go to someone that sells guns for a living, so a gun shop, for example, or Bass Pro Shop or somewhere like that, they have to be federally licensed to do so. To do that, any federally licensed firearm dealer is required to do background checks on everyone that does a purchase. So if I purchase from any of the normal avenues that people would purchase a gun from, I've got to pass a background check. There are a lot of people flooding that system in the last few years. Post 2020, we had a huge spike in people purchasing guns, including a lot of first-time gun owners. And so that system is pretty broken. It's called NICS, N-I-C-S, and the mass shooting in Texas that happened at the church, that was an ex-Navy guy that was dishonorably discharged for beating his wife. Should have been in that system, but the Navy didn't pass along the information to the system, so the system let him pass his background check and purchase a weapon. I don't think we need to add more people to that background check list for a couple of reasons. One, it's legal, as I mentioned, for me to buy a gun from a friend or a brother or just a stranger even, without a background check. If we made everyone do a background check in that situation, it's just going to add more to that system and it's going to back it up. And one thing that's interesting about the background check system is that if I go into a Bass Pro Shop, for example, and want to purchase a weapon, if my background check doesn't come back immediately, they won't let me leave with the gun. But the government only has 72 hours to reply, a yes or no. If they don't reply in 72 hours, I can go back in and they have to sell me the weapon. And that's to prevent the government from just slow rolling those background checks to prevent people from buying weapons. You know, that would be shady. And it seems like something someone like Biden or Obama would absolutely do because they're like, well, if Congress won't do something, I'll just slow down the NICS system. So we have that check in place on purpose. If we add more background checks, I think there's a better chance of things slipping through the cracks like they have, where we don't have these systems talking to each other. So I think we got to fix the background check system first before we add any more paperwork to it. And here's the truth is most gun owners, are legal, like totally law-abiding citizens. Concealed carry holders, like specifically, have a lower arrest rate than police do as far as criminals, among us. And so, concealed carry holders are generally very, very law-abiding, and we'd be doing background checks for them when we don't really need to. And so I don't think it would really help, but I'm not necessarily opposed to it. I don't think there's anything unconstitutional about it, because if they were, then background checks wouldn't be able to be legal at all. I just think it would overwhelm the system and it wouldn't help. And the main reason I think that is because I have not found one example ever of a mass shooter that that a universal background check specifically would have helped, where they either, purchased it from a stranger or a friend or something like that. There have been some that have been straw purchases, which means that the person purchases the weapon and passes the background check, knowing they're going to just pass that weapon on to someone else. And that happened in San Bernardino too. And that guy did get prosecuted for it. But for the most part, they don't prosecute people that do this because it's wives and girlfriends and grandmas of gang members for the most part that do that kind of thing. And DAs obviously don't want to go after those people, but I think we have to have better enforcement of if people A, do straw purchases, and B, if they do what happened in a couple situations where they're an elite, someone who cannot purchase a gun tries to buy one anyway and tries to pass a background check, and we reject it. That is illegal, and we should charge people criminally for that act. I've mentioned this on the show before. In 2017, there was a study by the government that showed that there were 112,000 attempts by people who weren't allowed to purchase weapons, tried to do background checks to purchase a weapon, and obviously failed. But do you know how many people they prosecuted out of those 112,000? It was like 10. So just, they only investigated like 100 of them, they investigated less than, it was like 10,000 of them they investigated, and they only brought charges to like 10 or something. Well, that's just a bad record. That's us as a society saying we don't really take this stuff seriously. And I think we should take it more seriously. So universal background checks, I basically think I've seen no evidence that there's been a mass shooting that would have been prevented by having universal background checks where I have to pass a background check to buy a gun from my brother, for example. So I don't think that's a good idea. We also have magazine bans. A lot of people want to have limits on how many bullets something can carry. And before you really gun nuts come after me, I know that they're called cartridges, but we're going to call them bullets because that's what most people call the things that are inside of guns. Okay. I think there's a legitimate argument that an AR with a 30-round magazine is potentially a little more deadly than one with a 10-round magazine in the sense that I can fire 30 rounds before I have to reload. Reloading's not hard though. You press a button, a magazine drops, you put another one in. I just don't think this is the solution that people think it is, especially when there are something like 150 million magazines for these guns allegedly floating around the country. So, California and some other states do have 10-round magazine limits. I think that that's just an attempt at, now that so many guns have more than 10 rounds, because most semi-automatic handguns have more than 10 rounds if it's not a tiny pistol. I think it's just their attempt to make it a little bit harder. They're also doing things like trying to tax ammo, which I don't think will hold up in court. Because again, you're saying, okay, well, poor people can't defend themselves. I think there's all sorts of these ideas that are just bad, and they don't prevent mass shootings because guess what? Someone doesn't care about if they're willing to go die in a blaze of glory. So they say. They don't care about the cost of stuff. Sometimes they'll just put this on a credit card. They don't care about a tax, and they'll buy 10-round magazines instead of 2 30-round magazines, honestly. Body armor is another one kind of in the magazine ban realm where we're like, we should ban body armor. They should never. Well, only 16 of those 333 mass shooters actually it was 345 mass shooters in those 333 mass shooting incidents. Only 16 of them wore any kind of body armor. The body armor thing is not really the problem that people think it is either. And so again, I'm not saying it would do harm, but I am saying all you're doing is punishing normal law-abiding citizens potentially with no benefit on the back end. And I think that's silly. Here's a couple of more interesting things that I've heard. So this is one that I think is, actually, let's talk about red flag laws first, because I think those are more the thing that we're seeing brought up a lot. So in this Maine one, the first kind of headlines I saw were like, Maine really lacks gun control laws because they don't have a red flag law. Well, most states don't have red flag laws yet at this point. Red flag laws, in case you are unfamiliar, are basically, the idea is, and these are state level things. And so they're all different. But the basic idea is that if you knew someone really well, and for instance, you're a family member or you work with them, or in some cases, like with K through 12 education, it could be one of their teachers or counselors or someone like that, can go to the police and say, I think this person is a danger to themselves or others, and I don't think they should be able to have weapons temporarily. They would go before a judge, and here's a really important part about red flag laws. to me, they would have to have, if they don't have this part where the defendant, the person who someone's trying to take their guns away from them or prevent them from getting guns, can't go before a judge and make their case. Like, I think you need to have both sides here to say, like, here's the reasons why we think Tom should not be able to have weapons. He's been depressed. He's been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he has weapons, and I'm scared he's either going to kill himself or others with them. And a judge could look at that and go, yeah, okay, we see your mental health history. We're going to put a temporary, and I think it needs to be absolutely temporary, and we're going to say, we're going to take your guns from you for 6 months, and we're going to reevaluate you in 6 months, and we'll see what goes from there. But the point is, it's a way to get around the fact that most of these mass shooters do not have criminal convictions that would prevent them from purchasing a weapon. And so we want to see the warning signs. Because here's the thing. The warning signs are almost always there. The Vegas one is the only situation I'm aware of that we literally never knew the guy's motivation. He had no history of violence, no criminal history, and he was in his 50s, and it's just a mystery to everyone. Almost everyone was like, well, yeah, this guy was like killing animals when he was a kid, and then he was shooting pellet guns in people, and one time he fired a gun in the air to intimidate someone. These are all things that we should go, okay, first of all, those are all illegal things to do for the most part. We should criminally charge people for things that we say are laws, because what's the point of having laws if we're not going to enforce them? But either way, a red flag law is a way to say, okay, they haven't been violent yet, but we're worried they might be, and so we want a way to temporarily take away their guns or prevent them from purchasing ones because we think they're a danger to themselves or others. Here's where I'm on the fence here. People like David French, who I really like reading, he's a lawyer and he's a gun guy and he lives in Tennessee, so he's very much in the gun culture, but he thinks these are great ideas. But when narrowly tailored and with really specific rules and very hyper local and limiting the scope of who can turn someone in. Because I think, for example, it shouldn't be able to be an ex-girlfriend or boyfriend, for example. I think there can be too much animosity there, and maybe they're just trying to be vindictive. But I do think family members and faculty, if you're in school, and police officers potentially could bring this kind of attention. So, for example, in most of these situations, we find out that they had previous encounters with law enforcement, domestic disturbances or threatening notes or things like that, where the police come and talk to them. And there's actually some really interesting stuff that the FBI is doing right now for this kind of stuff, where they'll partner with local law enforcement to say, hey, we can help kind of guide you and show you what is this person at risk if they're not? And they can kind of like facilitate some of what goes on without the person ever knowing the FBI was involved in it. But the red flag laws would be a way to take that and say, look, we think this person is a threat and here's why. And a judge could rule out order. And I think it's really important that they are temporary. We could do a whole episode on red flag laws. In general, I think that they're a decent proposal. However, in a lot of these states that have them in place, they have not prevented this kind of thing, even though there were the warning signs, because I think people have not actioned. The people closest to those people that might harm themselves or others are not taking the action to go to the police or whoever the proper authorities are and say, hey, I think this person is actually a threat to themselves or others. And so an interesting solution I read this week, actually, in the American Spectator, which is definitely a right-wing publication, their suggestion is, what if we required like 5 signatures from someone the person knows in real life, not online, that would say, this person, I think, should be allowed to buy. They were specifically framing it around so-called assault weapons. All right, so via the article, it says, most assault rifle killers are emotionally deformed, unstable, asocial or antisocial, reclusive, and estranged from people who know them. The people who live around them and know them well, they know that about them. What if it took the supporting signatures of 5 people who knew the purchaser well to be a prerequisite to purchasing an assault rifle? I don't know what the legalities of this are. I don't have a lot of problems. I actually think it would work better than red flag laws in the sense that it puts because the assault rifles, ARs, have become sort of the visual representation of what these people want to do and the scare factor that they're trying to get with this. They want that gun because the people that came before them used that kind of gun. If we made them gather the signatures, it would maybe prevent them from doing so. I don't think it's a terrible idea, because what that would do is if someone comes to me who I think shouldn't own an AR and they ask me to sign a thing, I'm either going to say no, or I might call the police and be like, hey, this guy's trying to buy a weapon, and I absolutely don't think he should because of X, Y, and Z. I saw him threaten someone. I saw him punch a girl or whatever. I think it would make it a little easier for those people to come forward because they would see that like this guy is trying to buy a weapon, and maybe they'd think a little bit more about like, why is he trying to buy a weapon? So I'm interested to see an actual legal argument about this, but it's at least an interesting idea. And this is like the kind of idea that I'd like to see more of. It's kind of an outside the box thinking. And I don't see any reason right off the top of my head that it would be constitutionally illegal. I can't think of a reason it's more of a problem than a background check. And especially if we narrowly tailored it just to the ARs specifically, since those are such a kind of the culture of these mass shooters tends to want an assault rifle of some sort. And so it might help. Who knows? Okay, so those are some solutions that I think maybe work, maybe don't. But here's a couple that I think are actually more promising based on the data. Okay, so the first is, no one likes this answer, but gun-free zones are a problem. You look at the FBI data and it does not actually specify, while it says what kind of place it was, is this a public place, is it a private business, etc. It does not specify if guns were allowed, like if, concealed carry holders or basically armed citizens were allowed to be armed in that place. It doesn't specify that. I think that's, I don't know, I feel like that's a little bit of a disservice because I think that does matter. I think that's part of the reason the Texas numbers are lower than California's is because I think that just stereotypically, whether it's true or not, if I asked you, where do you think you're more likely to run into someone that's concealed carry legally, like an armed citizen? Where do you think you're going to run into? And I think most people would say Texas. It just kind of has that reputation, whether it's true or not, statistically. And so I think gun-free zones are a little bit of a problem. There are obviously a bunch of different state laws. There are certain states where a no guns allowed sign means it's a felony to bring a gun into there. And so therefore, law-abiding citizens are going to follow those rules for the most part. And then you're going to be in a situation where you've got a bunch of people, and the only people that will have guns are people that are willing to break the law. And sometimes that person will be a mass shooter. And so there are, so as I mentioned, FBI doesn't mention that. FBI tries to say that the numbers they look at when they have talked about this, you'll see media say that like, well, it's a negligible number. It looks like only 4% of these were ended by a civilian with a gun. But there is a group of researchers, it's at crimeresearch.org, and what they specifically is look way more into the details and the nuance of some of these cases, and they say, okay, for example, someone is inside of a business and starts screaming erratically and says, I'm going to go get my gun. And they go to their car to get their gun. And when they come back and start shooting, an armed citizen stops them. Well, maybe they didn't get a chance to shoot anyone yet, but they would have if they weren't stopped by a civilian. That does not get counted by the FBI because it doesn't qualify yet as an active shooter incident, and it also doesn't qualify as a mass shooting in most of these things because no one else got shot. This happens a lot, but it doesn't make the news a lot. That something is, before someone can do the damage that they wanted to inflict, they are stopped by an armed citizen. And so that crimeresearch.org says that 51% of incidents were stopped by an armed citizen from 2014 to 2021. The data they were looking at specifically, because they started looking at this data in like 2021 and were trying to go backwards, it became a lower and lower percentage for every year because they didn't have the data. And sometimes the FBI, for example, gets bad information. There was a shooting in a church in Texas where they attributed it to an armed security guard, but it was just an armed, it was a former law enforcement, but he was just an armed citizen in the congregation, sort of acting as security, but he wasn't a paid security guard or professional security guard. And there's the reason this matters is because the whole point of the Second Amendment and an armed citizenry is to prevent this kind of thing from happening. You can't always count on law enforcement to get there quickly. I don't understand how in Maine this guy went from bowling alley to bar to I don't understand how there wasn't a police response that was faster. But this is a situation where we can't always count on the police to be able to get there super quickly, and especially in these kind of large crowds, or there's a lot of confusion and stuff. And so I'm not saying it's the end-all answer, but we've got to at least talk about armed citizens being a part of this, and we've got to at least give it the credit that it's due. A lot of people say there is absolutely no upside to having guns, and I just think that they're not looking at these stats. There are stats that say that upwards of 1 million to 2 million violent incidents are prevented every year by people having guns. They might not even have to pull them or fire them, but that gun still, even just saying, I have a gun and I will use it. Like someone's trying to break in my door, and if I'm behind it and I say, I have a gun, and if you come into this house, you're going to get shot, that might prevent the violence from happening, even though no one had to draw a weapon in that situation. And there's mass shooting situations where that happens as well. I think, for example, in education, everyone knows because of the law that if you are in a gun-free zone in a school, I think that's foolish of us to put basically a giant sign that says, here you can probably kill a lot of people without getting killed first. So I'm for like arming teachers. Honestly, my opinion, and I've said this on the podcast before, I don't even think you'd have to arm the teachers if you just had a sign that said, hey, we train and arm faculty that wants to be. If that's the sign outside, no one else is allowed to bring guns, but we have some. I think that most people would move on to the next place. And unfortunately, I don't have the ability to prove that. I just think that you look at some of these mass shooters, and in their sort of planning or manifestos or whatever, they specifically say, well, I picked this place originally, but then I ended up moving to this other one because it had less security, or it was easier to get into, or I thought there would be fewer people that had weapons inside of there. So I think we've got to talk about gun-free zones and how they only mean they're gun-free for law-abiding citizens and not for people that are willing to commit murder. I think the federal government could do more to encourage businesses to not slap that no gun sign on the door for a liability reason. Like, I think there are laws that we could pass that would say, like, you're not going to be held criminally liable or even civilly liable for someone bringing a gun to your establishment and shooting people by not having that sign or something. I think there's a lot of little things like that we could do that would just bring down, it would just be one more thing that someone would think about before they go into a place, because their goal is to kill as many people as possible, even if their end goal is to kill themselves. And so we've got to try to prevent that. And so I do think good guys with a gun solve some of this problem. It's not the entire problem, though. If every citizen in this country carried a gun, I wouldn't feel more safe, because I think most people are not responsible enough to carry a gun. I really want people to be well-trained, in their right state of mind. You know, I think not having guns in bars, for example, good law. People drinking alcohol, not a good combination, but I wouldn't mind the bartender having one. You know, that's just me personally. So I think there's some solution there. It's not a national, most of this is not a federal law that you can solve this with. And so Congress trying to get in the middle of it, I just don't think is great, because I think what you are better off doing is letting states try to figure this out. And when we see something working in a state, we implement it. For example, red flag laws that I talked about a moment ago, you know, in a few of the states that have implemented them, they have seen suicide rates go down by firearm in those states. And I think that makes sense to me. And because the Venn diagram of the lonely kind of lone wolf guy that doesn't have a job, maybe lives in his parents' basement, you know, this sort of like caricature that we end up having of a lot of these shooters, I think that there's a big overlap with the people that commit suicide or have drug overdoses and things. So I think preventing the suicides is a way to prevent the mass shootings as well. It's not going to be a direct correlation that we can, or causation that we can see maybe in data, but I'm for things that reduce even suicide gun violence, because that's very sad, and that is 2/3 of firearm deaths. So I think there's enough of an overlap there that it's worth looking at, and looking at the states that have implemented stuff and seeing what works. And there's a really nerdy paper that I do not understand the math that went into it that I'll link to, that's basically looked at those state laws. So like magazine restrictions, red flag laws, et cetera, and then tried to look at its effect, look at the crime rates before and after they were implemented. And it basically found that all the things that we talk about every time don't really make that big of a difference to mass shootings specifically. So magazine limits and AR bans and red flag laws and background checks, none of them really made a dent in specifically mass shootings, although a couple of them did, like red flag laws, and a couple of them did make a difference in suicides and prevention. And so I think there's enough of an overlap there that it might make a difference. But you know, then my other one is like, there's a couple of really dumb ones that I feel like are crazy that we don't do. We don't allow military personnel to carry firearms on military bases. And there have been these shootings on military bases. I think that's crazy. These are very well-trained people. Let's let them carry weapons. I know that's not going to solve everything, but like it's a thing. Like people are always like, if it'll save one life, we should do it. Okay, well, that's something we should do. We trust them to carry guns in the military. They should be able to carry them on base. That's just, I think that's reasonable. Like I said, let's encourage fewer gun-free zones. And then, let's pay more attention to who is doing this and less about the instrument they use to carry out these mass shootings. Because we could look at assault rifles, so-called, and there's 20 million of them in the country, and yet they're only, over the last 20 years, in 0.3% of murders. So percentage-wise, not really being used for crimes very often. So why would we punish everyone else for this tiny little sliver that we might not even be able to prevent? I think it's better to look at who the people are that are doing this. And that's where I think the media really comes in. I think the media is the key to all of this and could make a much bigger difference. But the problem is we cannot regulate the media to do so via law because of the First Amendment, which is just as important as the Second Amendment. We can't tell media to say, hey, you can't say the guy's name or can't put the guy's picture on TV. But I strongly believe, and you'll see a lot of media companies are catching on to this and are not publishing names and pictures as much. The Maine thing was a little different because we were looking for the guy for 48 hours. We needed his picture so that the citizens could help find him. But for the most part, especially when someone's already dead, I think there is zero benefit to showing the picture, broadcasting on the news what their manifesto was, why did they do this, trying to get into the psychology of everything. I don't think that matters. I know that sounds counterproductive because I just said it does matter in the sense that we need to know who these people are, but we, the people, don't need to know who these people are necessarily. I think it's good to know the warning signs. I think it's good to know, here's the things we missed. Law enforcement went to this guy's door, 6 times over the last 2 months. Okay, so we know that. How do we turn what was obviously someone telling the police this guy's troubled and turn that into actions that could prevent him from getting weapons or from doing this? The FBI is working on this right now. They actually have basically a task force that it works with local law enforcement to aid them without really the FBI presence ever being around, but basically being like, okay, we've got this guy. What can we do? Well, maybe we need to get him into mental health counseling. Maybe we need to get him, there's all sorts of things that need to happen. And they kind of go along with that mental health thing, except it's not mental illness. It's mental health. Not all of these people are schizophrenic or sociopaths or something like that. Some of them are just lonely, depressed people that think they have nothing to live for. And if we can show them that that's not true by, whatever, their family could help with that, their friends could help with that, mentors could help with that, the police could help with that. There's all sorts of people, and the FBI is trying to put together resources that basically help local law enforcement identify these people that are the biggest threat and intervene with possibly things that aren't just taking away their weapons, because I still don't think that even works, because you could take away someone's guns and then they're just going to rent a U-Haul and run into a crowd of people. We've seen that happen. We've seen an uptick of those kind of attacks happen. You want to take away that violent tendency, and that's a lot harder to do as a society of 350 million people, right? But I think the media has a huge role in this, in the sense that most of these active shooters, these mass shooters, are influenced by the mass shooters that came before them. And there's a great Malcolm Gladwell article in the New Yorker, I think from 2014, I'll link to. And it specifically talks about how Columbine was kind of this catalyst event that a lot of people, especially the younger and the school shooters, mimic so many things that they did. And it's clearly a copycat situation. And I know that the internet exists. I know people can look most of this stuff up if they want to, but I do think the press would really be doing the whole country a huge service by saying, you know what? We're not going to say the person's name over and over again. We're not going to put their face. We're not going to link to their racist website. We're not going to publish their manifesto online so that they get to preach and they get the platform that they wanted and the notoriety they wanted. We want to discourage people from thinking this is a good idea and it's a way to gain notoriety. I think the media already does this with suicides, for example. They will never show someone threatening to jump off a bridge on the local news because they know it influences other people to threaten to jump off a bridge. And so you notice like NFL, MLB, they won't show a person running on the field ever on camera. They always cut away from it. They never show it. The only way you can find that online now is from cell phone footage and stuff. And it discourages it from happening. And so the media has to self-regulate that, though. It's not something that the federal government can say, hey, you can't do this because freedom of press. And I'm all for freedom of press. I think we absolutely need that. But there is also a responsibility that they have to tell the story. It is news. It deserves to be told, especially when, dozens of lives are lost or injured in the situation. It amounts to, kind of a terror attack to escape. And like that town in Maine was like locked down for a couple days because they didn't know if this guy was still out there trying to hunt people. And that's terrible. We should try to prevent that. But in situations where someone's already dead by their own hand or by the police, I just don't see any reason we need to talk more about this person's motivations. I think law enforcement should know about it. I think that they should study that and become better aware of how to see the signs and then relay those signs to us as the public. I think that here's some signs to look for. Someone's isolated, they're online, or whatever the list of things is. Now, I also think that a lot of people are like that who are not violent. There's a lot of loners, but there's all sorts of other sad stuff that happens with them. Like I said, suicides or, honestly, just depression. There's lots of things that we can help people with and catch before it gets to the point where they want to be violent. That's hard because that requires all of us to do that. That requires you and me to do that with the people we know and we think might be a danger to themselves or others, if that is someone that we happen to be in contact with. And it takes it off of the government. The government is not going to be able to prevent things like this. When a lone wolf who plans the whole thing with no one's help, you got to keep in mind, the reason it's hard to carry out a terrorist attack in America is because normally it's not just one person. They have to coordinate with other people. And that's how the FBI, gets onto you, or there's informants or there's undercover people. But if someone's just sitting in their room and planning this whole thing out for months and doesn't talk to anyone about it, it's very hard to prevent. And I think that that's more where the people around that person, because almost none of these people are a complete island, even if they are isolated. I just don't know that red flag laws are totally right, because I don't know what the catalyst is for me if I had a friend like that. Like where would the line be where I'd feel comfortable like going to the authorities and for him to know that it was me? What if I was wrong, and would that be embarrassing? I think people are scared to accuse someone of something so bad. And so I just don't know how well even having red flag laws in place prevent that from happening. But maybe the signature thing works, or maybe we just need to know what the signs are so that we can say, hey, I see this in you, that you have violent tendencies, or you seem like you might be suicidal, or you seem like you're talking a lot about these mass shooters, and I'm concerned that you are looking up to them. I don't know. Their relationships matter, and as we become more isolated, less religious, and more I'm a Christian. I think religion is important, but you may not, and that's totally fine. But I do think we have a breakdown of community too. We don't have bowling leagues like we used to, or whatever sort of clubs that we used to have a lot more. Softball leagues and these kind of things. I just don't think we have some of those community ties, and there's a lot of people slipping through the cracks when you look at suicide rates and mass shooters and depression and these deaths of despair of like drug overdoses. And I think all of it is related to these mass shooters for the most part. It's not 100% across the board, but most of them, it's like the same thing we hear over and over again. So I don't know how we prevent that, but these are just a few of the things. But basically, keep an eye out. I'm all for suggestions. I just think that some of these so-called common sense gun reforms would make zero difference when it comes to this specific kind of crime that is absolutely terrible. And obviously we all want to prevent. I know people on the left don't think the right think that. I just don't find that to be true. And I also think that we do a really good job of just doing a caricature of the worst version of the other side, and the left does it to the right and the right does it to the left. And I just don't think that's where most people are. I think most of us would love to be able to snap our fingers and prevent these kind of tragedies from happening again. We just don't live in a world where that's possible, especially lone wolf situations where they're going to carry this out on their own and plan it on their own. I think it's really hard. There are some things we can do at the margins, though, that will improve things. And I'm all for the discussion. So anyway, that is today's episode. Thank you for joining me. If you haven't yet, please subscribe on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow on Instagram. You can also email me if you've got any questions or things you want me to talk about at blake@thehomelessconservative.com. That's it for me this time. I will catch you next week.